All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I am Becca from Becca Phoenix Books in Toronto, and joining us today is Wole Talabi and Jiang. Wole Talabi is a Nigerian author and editor whose works have been the finalist for the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. We're here to celebrate the release of his most recent work, Convergence Problems. Joining him is Jiang. Is the author of Lincoln, and whose works have been nominated and finalist for the Nebula and Bram Stoker Awards. They will be in conversation, and we will be fielding audience questions at the end. So feel free to pitch in the chat, and I'll be relaying it on to them. Otherwise, you two take it away, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you
very much for hosting us. And yeah, it's nice to talk with you, And yes, I was going to say, so what do you want to start with talking about? Convergence problems. I guess I should start by telling people something about the book.
Yes, I think that would be a good idea.
I will do that. But before I do that, congratulations. Your novella Lincoln just got nominated for the Bram Stoker Award. That is correct, yes?
Yes. So exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really cool horror novella. So congratulations.
Thank you again.
Right. And Convergence Problems, which is my new book, is a collection of stories, 16 stories, mostly about our relationship with technology, largely from an African, and within Africa, largely from a Nigerian lens and point of view, but thinking about global human philosophical problems within that context of our relationship to technology. So it's mostly an African futurist collection, but at the same time, I also feel like it's a bit of a showcase for my writing. It's my second collection. With my first collection, I was trying to put out, a collection that contained strong stories, right? You want to show people that, yes, I can write well. And with this one, I was kind of experimenting a bit more. I was happier to do more interesting things, a bit more intricate things, experiment with form, with style, with points of view, but all still kind of linking to the same theme, which was considering largely our relationship with technology. There are a few fantasy stories in there. So it's not all science fiction. There are a few urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy stories. And for those of you joining us live who know me from my novel, Shigidi and the Brass Head of Obalufon, there is even a story in which Shigidi makes an appearance as a bit of a minor villain, secondary villain, let's say. So yeah, it's a little bit of everything. It's a bit of sampling, but I think it's an interesting collection. Some of the stories are as short as 1,000 words. Some of them are as long as 30,000 words, which is technically a novella. So yeah, that's Convergence Problems, and I really hope people enjoy reading it.
So I just wanted to kind of like fangirl a little bit here after finishing like that's why I'm here, right? I'm the hype person. But I just love how it's kind of like a blend. Like your writing is so poetic and lyric, like, but then there is also a stark contrast of like industrial imagery and metaphor that I feel like just works so well. And I am not like very technical personally, but I do love to muse about philosophy and ethics, and especially now in relation to technology as it's becoming more prominent in our world, right? And also philosophy in relation to like invention and innovation, which a lot of your stories touch upon, and in your author's notes too that I read last night. And I feel like what makes convergence problems so fascinating to me from is like the technical point of view technical point of view that you take, because I don't understand kind of like the background mechanics and intricacies of technology, but what I experience is kind of like the impact and effects of it being brought into the world, both the consequences and kind of the merits of its existence in our lives. And now in particular, because of what it means for the future of art and creativity in relation to like human connection. And you kind of talk about this a little bit in terms of AI and like the ethics of it all. And I was wondering if you can talk a bit more about it in terms of your collection or in general.
Oh yeah. I think a lot about the philosophy and ethics of technology development. I think that's a thread running through the book. And the opening story is a story about AI, and the closing story is a story about AI. And the middle novella is mostly a story about AI. So it's something that comes up a lot, but they all take different points of view. And for me, I think thinking about there's something my dad used to say, which is the history of humanity is largely the history of technology. And I think that's kind of true from a certain point of view, because when we think about different ages of humanity, or at least when people put things in historical perspective, that way, they normally think of the dominant technology. There's the steel age, there's the stone age, there's the bronze age, there's the information age, and these are all references to the core thing driving technology that is available at the time. And I think one of the reasons people do that is because it affects everything. Even for those that may not know exactly how the technology works, we're all affected by it. So we all need to kind of think about it. And for me, coming from an engineering point of view, being an engineer actively involved with technology development, I love the process of technology development, but I feel like sometimes working with other engineers, we can be a bit blind to taking that long view of its impact outside of just, oh, this is cool, we figured out a way to do something. But those kinds of framing questions of beyond the how, sometimes we also need to think about the why and the should we. And if we do, who will benefit from this? And what systems are going to be elevated by it? What systems are going to be negatively affected by it? And a lot of the time, as engineers, we don't think about that. A lot of the time, some engineers I've met don't even want to. They feel like we shouldn't. It shouldn't even be part of the thought process. There's this school of thought that you should be almost immune to the outside effects of whatever technology or scientific development you're working on, and only think about, are we making progress? And I think that's a very wrong-headed view, because progress is relative and it's not an absolute. There is, among certain people, there's this school of thought that science is purely and perfectly objective. Newsflash, nothing involving humans is objective. We are all coming at things from different points of view. Even logic is structured a certain way from a certain point of view. This is something I explore a lot with my more recent fiction. Thinking about what I, in mathematics, will refer to as boundary conditions. Every time you set up an equation or a system for understanding something, whatever it is, we always impose some kind of assumption or boundary condition. That boundary condition or assumption you're making is a statement of philosophy. It's not a purely scientific thing. It is a statement of, this is the approach I wish to take, because it's a simplification, because I want to ignore certain things, because I think that this is important and this is not. That's a statement of philosophy, not so much pure science a lot of the time. So anyway, my point being, the impact that technology has on everyone's lives is something that I think is interesting, and it's something that I like to muse about, not just current technology, but future technology. And I personally think more people need to, so I think two things need to happen. I think most people in STEM, right, science, technology, engineering, math, whatever, need to be more familiar with the social sciences, with core philosophy, with poetry, with arts, like the things that feel very, very human that we think are not logical, but are actually logical from the most fundamental part of who we are. At the same time, I also think it's important for people who have no technical background, who come at things from a purely social science point of view, or just, living in the world with no technical background. I think it's important for them to also get a sense of what these things are, what technology is, of how it works, of how beautiful it can be. I always say like mathematics is a lot like poetry. In fact, I strongly believe math is essentially poetry or music. It's the kind of poetry or music that you use to understand the world, right? Mathematics is the poetry of physics. I don't want to get into a horror argument people have about whether math is even real, to be honest, because that's a real thing. People are not sure if math is real or not, or if it's just a language that we use to understand things. But my point is, these things are beautiful, and in my mind, they're constantly intertwined. So I love, writing technology in a beautiful, moving, lyrical way, linking it to how it affects humanity, while at the same time putting sometimes all of the interesting technical detail that might be there. Some of it is made up, right? I write science fiction. This is not a pure technical paper. But I like to carry that sense, that feeling that you get sometimes when you read something beautiful but technical at the same time. And you just kind of get swept up in this sense of wonder, like, really, the world works like this? Because sometimes science is magic. It literally is. It literally can be pure magic. And that's just fun. That's just fun sometimes. So it's a really ripe place for writing, for speculating. I mean, this is why science fiction exists, right? People love to speculate about certain aspects of science and technology. So it is lovely, it is fun, great stories come from there. And going back to my original statement and what my dad used to say, if the history of humanity is largely the history of technology, then it kind of stands to reason that the future of humanity will also largely be the future of technology. So thinking about the future of science and technology is thinking about the future of ourselves.
Okay, so many thoughts. Let me try to gather them. The first one I think is when you were talking about science and math kind of as magic. And I remember because when I was younger, we had the computer with, the floppy disk. That is the age I was born in. But then I remember back then, I didn't really know how it worked. And when phones came out, I was like, what do you mean there's things on a screen? And it's all because of like small microchips and mechanisms, right? And it was all mind boggling to me. But I was also thinking about how you were talking about the way technology kind of elevates, but also in a way de-elevates life in a way, depending on how you look at it. And I was thinking about in your story and how some of them kind of tackle privacy and the lack of as a result of technology. Like it's very good in terms of accessibility, where we are able to access far more information than we are before and connect with people that we previously wouldn't have because of distance or otherwise. But then there's also kind of the spread of misinformation as a result, because there's not really as much gatekeeping in terms of information and who can contribute to that information and kind of change it. And I was thinking about the way our phones are kind of listening into our every conversation now, and privacy agreements to use different apps and tools becoming more and more invasive. And the way like algorithms are catering to our interests and perhaps eventually, maybe in the future, flipping that and become the curator of our preferences instead and kind of manipulating it to benefit corporations. It makes me think of like 1984 and things like that, and the way that like some companies end up placing their blame on technology and AI and using them as scapegoats for their own misconduct. Some articles I've been reading recently in the news, but who knows? Misinformation, anyways. But yeah, so I was wondering what your thoughts are on that is and kind of the future of AI in terms of it kind of controlling our preferences and invading into our privacy.
Yeah, so that's a perfect setup, thank you, for kind of talking about what I think is the centerpiece of the collection, which is the novella Ganga. And I think my opinions on a lot of this are essentially summarized in the villain of the story, who is someone we kind of encountered through other people. She is essentially your tech billionaire who believes that technology is the solution to everything. And if we can have perfect surveillance, we can have perfect control. And in her mind, this is a kind of utopia, right? So we have a villain that's trying to build what she believes is a utopia. And the fact that I cast someone that thinks that way, who is a technocrat, right? Someone with a pure technical background that's supposed to be very smart, that's CEO of her own company that she built and is essentially trying to build a utopia. The fact that I cast someone like that as a villain, it essentially shows what I think about this. And what that is at the end of the day, the technology is just a tool. Technologies are enablers. They can enable almost anything. The problem always comes down to what we choose to use them for and who's in charge of them and how those tools are deployed. So, for example, if you have a tool that enables more communication like we do now, right, with our mobile phones, and of course, in a pure science fiction tradition, we could extrapolate that. What if we could directly upload our thoughts into some kind of system, right? And within this system, you could immediately have automatic translation. You could have perhaps people wouldn't even need to speak to be able to communicate with each other. There is so much potential if you just allow your mind go there, which is something I kind of do in the book, right? Referencing direct neural interfaces that can read your thoughts up to a point. And if you take that technology, some people could view it from the point of view of, oh, this is perfect openness. There's no more lack of trust, because if you don't trust someone, you could literally expose your direct thoughts to them, right? Or if you're not sure, if you want to prove that to someone that they can trust you, you could literally directly connect your thoughts to each other and they would know for a fact that you're not hiding anything. Or I already mentioned, more perfect communication. So these are all good things. The framing now becomes when those thoughts are liberated from our brains, they go somewhere to be processed. And who's in charge of that place? And what does that person want? And if their entire objective is to make money or something else, as long as their objective does not align with yours, there is always a potential for problems. So this is something that I've thought about a lot. And I personally think at the end of the day, you cannot have one person thinking about some kind of ideal version of humanity and driving their own vision of it forward, while the rest of us just go along with that. At the same time, you cannot have, how do I put this? You cannot have a purely profit-driven approach where the only thing that we're thinking about is making money, because then the natural thinking will be, if we have access to people's thoughts, let's just convince them to buy stuff. And that's kind of like the worst case scenario of capitalism, when the ultra capitalists and the techno capitalists essentially seize your mind. Oh, can you hear that? There's a weird sound. No. Okay, no, then it's fine. If you don't hear it, it's okay. It's just on my end then. Oh, okay. Becca says she can hear some music. 1 second. Okay, sorry.
Oh, there you go. You got it sorted. Cool.
Yes, there was something happening in the background of my house. Yeah. So essentially, my thoughts on surveillance is, I think we kind of need to reframe the context in which a lot of technology is created, and that's what the story Ganger is essentially about. It's about liberating a city that is under the control of this techno. I won't say techno-capitalists because they're post-capitalists. They've essentially ruined the world, so to speak. So it's a dystopia in that sense. But it's under the control of the vision of this one woman that essentially saved everyone. And everybody looks up to her and goes along with whatever she says because she owns all the technology and runs everything. And in the story, I have this young girl who is unsatisfied with living in this so-called utopia and wants to be free. And she essentially joins part of a revolution. But one of the things I wanted to show in the story is that in joining that revolution, it's not just your pure, or just seize the means of control from the evil queen or whatever. Even she comes into conflict with her own fellow revolutionaries because they're hiding things. And the point is, if you really want to build a new context for the development and application of technology, you essentially need to rebuild trust. We need to come at it from a community point of view. If we trust each other, then if we truly trust each other, then developing technology in that context has a very different point of view or has a very different impact than developing technology in a society where everybody's afraid of each other. Because you develop the same technology in these two separate contexts, you will get two very different futures. So it's more about rethinking the community and rethinking the way we live together. To me, these are far more important than thinking about the specifics of technology, surveillance, AI, because these things will always be developed, right? Scientists, technologies, we are constantly inquiring as to how the world works, as to how to make things. And whether on purpose or on accident, we're going to develop stuff. And that stuff is going to be utilized by someone in some context. So that context is the most important thing. It is literally the human thing.
When you were mentioning the way that things are developed and utilized, it kind of made me think about my sister's job. So she worked at I won't say which specifically, but it's like an oil factory place. But she works in the division of kind of like waste disposal and kind of like the eco sector kind of thing. And what she has to deal with basically is the other sectors making things that she later has to deal with because they're only focused on efficiency. But then even if that efficiency comes with like mass production of waste, right? That she has to later figure out how to get rid of, and how to persuade them not to, do that. But it seems always like, as you were saying, with capitalists, all they think about is making money, right? So her department is the one that has the least amount of funding versus the other departments that have a lot of funding. But on that, yeah.
No, I was just going to say again, it kind of goes back to even economics, right? Which is kind of it's a science. We'll allow them in the room. But even economics, whenever you say this is the optimum, this is the best approach, whatever it is, you're defining what terms are important, right? When we say even the term profit, when you're calculating profit, what is profit? The thing that you've essentially chosen the things that are important to you. If I remember correctly, even the word economics literally means from the original Greek, like an accounting of the house, or almost like housekeeping, right? An accounting of the things that are important in the house, something like that. So when you say something is profitable, that you've gained benefit from it, choosing what that benefit is a philosophical statement, right? It's not a purely scientific one. So some economists might say, yes, I've run all the numbers and this is the ideal way to, operate your systems. This is the best way to run your business. What does that mean? They've essentially taken some boundary condition and applied it and said, well, the only thing that matters is how much revenue you can generate to shareholders. Ideally, our economics models should be including things like, I don't know, employee happiness, limiting impacts to the environment, sustainability for future generations. If you included all those things and you parameterized them and put them in your equations and ran your economics models again, a lot of companies would not be profitable, right? And that's not a matter of science. That's a matter of philosophy. That's a matter of thinking about the context in which you want to operate your business. So that's what I mean is the science will follow. The science and technology application will follow. The key thing is for us as people to think more about essentially the politics and the social structures in which we are operating. Those will drive everything. The technology will go where we go, essentially.
So there was this one thing I wanted to talk about, which you talked about earlier, about kind of like, uploading the mind onto software and things like that, and technology almost as like transcendent or as post-human, and kind of like the implications on humanity and what it means to be human as a whole, and its impact on like evolution, culture, tradition, and the way that some see technology as hope while others see it as destruction, and the way development is a double-edged sword. So I wanted to kind of talk about, let me find my notes here. I had so many notes. Did I? Okay. Give me 1 second. Did I accidentally delete it? Okay, I'll go.
That's fine.
Oh no, I found it. No, I found it.
Awesome.
Electric Mother. And kind of like technology as religion itself, and as kind of the creator of new religion, in the way that technology has the ability, at least in the story, to kind of immortalize, to create technological ancestors that kind of change our connection to our ancestors from tradition and like generational histories, um, surrounding like how we would ask ancestors, spirits for their guidance, but like manifested in technology. And what's very interesting to me is kind of like how they had the shrines for the electric mothers, in the story, and how it kind of like resembles an engineered system instead. And the way I imagine it is kind of like the way you would put a desktop together. But I was also thinking about like the manipulation of the religion of ancestors, like in 1984, where history is kind of manipulated, versions of it um, wiped and changing daily depending on the circumstances and necessities of governmental powers. Like today we are at war with one country, the next day we are friends, but you wouldn't remember anything from the previous day. Or today we condemn such and such, but tomorrow we celebrate it. And though it doesn't seem necessarily different from the way our world works now, because it's much harder to wipe history, it kind of reminded me of like them using technology and kind of electric mothers to kind of manipulate through religion what we should do. And I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts about that, like technology of religion and things like that.
Yeah, so I'll give a bit of context. So in the story, A Dream of Electric Mothers, which is the last story in the collection, Convergence Problems, the story essentially follows a group of ministers in an alternate future where they are going to consult with their ancestors on a political problem. And the ancestors are essentially the recorded minds of all the previous citizens of the nation. And all these minds are recorded and stored digitally, and they're kind of meshed together to form this new emergent consciousness. And in some ways, it intertwines with religion. It's viewed in certain ways. I find it interesting that you use the word manipulate, because I actually think the ancestors are the ones doing the manipulation in the story. They're manipulating the ministers and the main characters. But to touch on that point, I actually think personally that our humanity is constantly changing. What it means to be human, what it means to have culture, tradition. These things are not static, right? They might have the illusion of being static, right? When you hear religion has been around for 800, 1,000 years, it sounds like it's been a long time. But there was a time before that religion when people believed in something else. There was a time before every culture. Culture is constantly changing, it's constantly evolving, especially with the impact of technology. Very few things have forced religions and cultures to adjust more than technology. When you look especially at, I'll use a very popular European example. One of the things that enabled the Protestant movement was the printing press, right? The availability of the printing press and the ability to actually print copies of the Bible and spread them to people. It changed the way people viewed Christianity and caused this schism. You could even go back to, in Nigeria, for example, there are certain things that are viewed as culture, right? There's a particular kind of cloth that people wear in many parts of Nigeria called Ankara cloth, but it's Dutch print, and it's something that was made by the Dutch when they were trying to copy the handmade batik material from Indonesia, and they tried to machine copy it. They tried to make machines that could do the same thing, and they didn't like the outcome because it didn't look like batik. So they essentially offloaded all the stuff that they had made into parts of Africa because they're just like, it's cheap and we don't like it. And it became so popular across Africa that it's viewed as a cultural, traditional item of clothing. So, but it's something that happened, a few hundred years ago at most. So culture itself, culture, religion, they are constantly being litigated. And in fact, so is science. At its very boundary, science is not that different from religion. The difference is that science willingly accepts updates, right? It's built into the system, the scientific method. You're constantly trying to falsify yourself. You come up with a theory, and your objective is not to prove that you're right, it's to prove that you are wrong. It's to try to find an exception to your theory. And if you do, then you update the theory, and that's considered a breakthrough. Whereas in many religions, the idea is to find some ideal truth, and then once it's been found, you stay there, right? Until something forces people to move, right? Maybe something in the world, some big event, some big technological innovation that is so obviously in conflict with that people have to shift or modify. So, coming back to your original question, I personally think that all these things are intertwined. Technology, science, religion, politics, culture. And as one of them changes, the others will follow. As people communicate with each other more, new emergent culture will come forward. So I think we kind of need to accept that. But in accepting that, then we can also accept that we can control to some extent how this change occurs. We can choose what to carry forward from the past, from the past religion, culture, or whatever, in the context of new understanding, new knowledge, new technological innovation. We can choose which parts to modify and which parts to keep. We can keep some core philosophy while changing the surface of certain practices around the religion and move forward with that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think it is a bad thing to lose some elements of culture, to lose some elements of religion. If the core of the religion, if the core of the culture is right, that can be maintained. For example, there are some cultures in which the overarching view or overarching philosophy is that us as a community, we're super important. And the rights of the community are more important than the rights of the individual, right? A communitarian view, or the individual only exists because of the community. So within that core philosophy, people develop certain practices around living together in a certain kind of system, around sharing of food and property and all of those things. The specifics of that culture can change. You could move out of your family compound into, I don't know, let's say in 100 years, you're living into joint orbital rings around some new planet. But if you keep the same core philosophy, which is a good one, that as a community, we want to stay connected, and that keeping that community together is more important than any specific individual, then we can now use technology to enable that. So you change the way you live, the specific layout of that, but we enable the same thing. We stay in constant contact with each other. We utilize technology in some way to ensure that we're always considering what the community wants rather than specific individual. That's the kind of change that I like to think about, is taking the core of some older, especially African traditional philosophy, and leaving the veneer, but taking the core idea and using that to build a kind of extrapolated future that's enabled by technology. That's something I love to do. It's something I did in that story, the final story in the collection, A Dream of Electric Mothers, which is taking the core idea of consulting with the ancestors. Is the main idea behind that is we want to be able to lean on the knowledge of the past. That's where that comes from. The specifics of it, that you need to go to a person, you need to go to a specific spiritual healer that has a specific method of communicating with the ancestors and translating their messages to you. I left all that out and said the core philosophy is we want to lean on the past knowledge of those that have come before us. So take that and extrapolate it to a different technologically enabled system. And that's how the idea for A Dream of Electric Mothers comes up, where they do the same thing essentially, but now instead of imagining that the ancestors are just spirits floating around and there's this babalawo that can connect you to them somehow using cowries and a pot and some magic potion, I imagine you do essentially the same thing, but with quantum computers.
So I did have a follow-up question to that, but we were just past an audience question. I apologize if I butcher the name. Mwenya Chikwa asks, do you think sci-fi will ever tackle the issues of mineral sourcing for the impossible technologies it envisions and the effects it has on the environment in deeper way?
I think it's happening already. So that's a good question, by the way. I think maybe if you go to kind of an older tradition of science fiction from the 60s to say late 90s, this was less common, right? And maybe even further back, where people would propose technologies and they were mostly extrapolating from current technologies, but they would propose these wild ideas of, humans being essentially a galactic species that is running on energy from somewhere. We've already achieved, technology leveled on the Kardashev scale, somewhere 2.0 or something like that. And that kind of advanced civilization would require a lot of resources and energy. And that was a question that was largely ignored, as I said, mostly in earlier science fiction. I think more recent science fiction is very, very much concerned with this, with the sourcing and impact on the environment. If I can think of work by people like Kim Stanley Robinson, for example, even more recently, Ray Naylor's book, The Mountain in the Sea, which is mostly about octopuses, but is also really about resources and control as well, and thinking about our impact on the environment and what that has done. And yeah, I can think of several other examples. This is something that is starting to happen. it's also something I've been thinking about as well. Cough, cough. I might be writing a story that's actually about that. I think many African science fiction authors have thought about this, have written about this. The South African author, Nick Wood, who unfortunately passed away last year, wrote what I think is essentially the reference African book on resources, African science fiction book that thinks about resources. It's called Water Must Fall, which is kind of a riff on the title of the movement from South Africa when they were thinking about reframing education, right? Fees must fall. So Water Must Fall is really kind of engages deeply with resource exploitation, especially for water, but other resources as well, and how that potentially could affect the rest of the world. So I think this is a question that's coming up more and more, and it's an important one to ask. At the same time, I kind of feel there's two ways to think about it. One is we of course require a lot of resources and a lot of energy to build certain kinds of technology. At the same time, the way those resources and the way those resources and the energy are generated and their impact, the impact of getting them, is largely a function of economic, political systems, not so much science and technology, right? Of course, science fiction, right? As science fiction writers, we should think about that, and we do. In fact, actually, in my story Ganger, I kind of talk about this as well, right? On the impact of resource extraction and how it's affected the environment and how trying to solve that problem actually makes it worse, thinking from a purely industrial point of view. But going back to my question, resources and energy management can be done ethically, I think. It is a function of thinking, changing the framework within which we come at the problem from. So I'll give an example. Just yesterday, I was in a conference talking about my day job now. I was in a conference where we were talking about hydrogen as a source of energy, because it's supposed to be so much cleaner than fossil fuels. This is something I'm largely involved in now, is hydrogen generation, management, all of these things. And one of the panelists said something really interesting is, in New Zealand, to convince people to allow them produce hydrogen, they had to think about the people's relationship to water. There's certain groups of people, native people in New Zealand, that view water as sacred and as the source of life. And so if you want to convert water into hydrogen, you need to split the H2O into H2 and O. If you want to split it, you're essentially killing water. And to them, this is something that would be culturally unacceptable. So when framing the problem about how do we generate the hydrogen, if you think about it in a different context from, oh, it's just efficient and it's cheap and it's energy dense and all of these things. But if you also come at it from a point of view of, do we want to destroy something that is fundamentally important? It might sound silly, but it gives you an alternative viewpoint to how do we generate the water that we use to generate the hydrogen? And what do we do with it when we're done? For example, if you want to get buy-in from people that have that point of view, you could say, well, whatever our process is, we will split the water into hydrogen and oxygen, but at the end of the process, we will put it back together. And this is another way of thinking about sustainability. You think about, we generate hydrogen, we use the hydrogen, and at the end of the combustion process, whatever we're using hydrogen for, it is converted back to water. It's a cyclic, everything comes back to balance. Within that point of view, it also forces you to think about the sustainability of your process, because you were just thinking, oh, we just want to make hydrogen, go, 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 money, money, money all the time. You might not think of the final result and what that could mean. So that's just one example. But sometimes the framework within which you think about the problem enables you to come up with a better way. And I think this is something science fiction authors are doing more and more, especially recently. It's something I tried to do in some of my recent fiction. I mentioned I'm working on a story right now that's related to resource management and extraction and the legacy of that. But I do think modern science fiction engages with this quite a lot.
It's funny because the duology I have coming out with Titan also tackles this, but through like a more philosophical point of view, because I'm not very scientific, but it's kind of like the impact of industrialism on nature. So I did have follow-up question to follow up that question. Um,
Go on.
you were talking about how like trying to solve a problem, but kind of making it worse and creating technology. And I was thinking about the way we create technology for the present rather than kind of for the future and not seeing the potential consequences that we will need to invent even more things to mitigate the harm for. And so my question is kind of reversion versus adaptation and kind of the creation of technology for this, because it seems like a lot of times we're trying to create technology to reverse the harm we've done to the environment, right? But then when we look at kind of the history of evolution and the way that humans came to be and different species came to be, they kind of adapt to the environment. And whether we should make technology that kind of caters more to that rather than reversion.
It's a great point. So fun fact that many people might not be aware of before I answer the question, is that plastics and microplastics, which are largely considered a huge environmental problem these days, were actually originally created as a solution to an environmental problem. Because I don't remember the exact year, but if you go back about 100 years or so, maybe a bit further, my sense of time scale is off. A lot of material was being made with ivory, with animal bones and wood, right? That's how almost all furniture was made. That's how even things like dental fittings were made. Everything was wood and ivory. And we were essentially cutting down all the trees and killing all the animals to make stuff. And there was a prize put out for someone that could come up with something that would reduce the amount of environmental destruction, some kind of artificial product that could replace a lot of these items. And one of these first ones was made by a man named Baker, I believe Bakelite, and then later on evolved into polymers and plastics and all of these things that replaced that use. The problem now is we've made too much of them, and they've become a problem in their own right. So we have a very long and storied history of creating the problem and then creating a new problem to fix that problem, and then creating a new problem to fix that problem. So you're very right in asking the question of thinking about reversion versus adaptation. And it's something, again, that gets at what I was thinking in the novella Ganger, in this book, was that kind of trying to reverse a problem, essentially engineer the impact of climate change out, led them to a bigger problem. And that core problem was thinking about things purely technologically instead of going back to the root cause, which is what is our underlying philosophy here. And I try to show in the story that there is a parallel between what happened with the environment of trying to use, essentially doubling down on technology as an independent, pure solution in the same system to fix a problem, creates a new problem. And I try to parallel that with what's happening with the main character in the story, where the person she meets that's trying to start this revolution is trying to use technology to supplant the person that's in charge. But she kind of points out to him that, no, actually what you need to change is the underlying philosophy, right? Before any real revolution can begin. So that essentially summarizes my thought is I think humans could adapt. I'm not sure we're built to. Humans are, maybe it's a bit of it's a bit of hubris to say that humans are a bit different from the rest of living biology on the planet, but I think it's largely true. If you think of just the scale of our impact on the planet, it's kind of clear that we're very different, right? Most other species on the planet they tend to grow to a point where they establish an equilibrium with their environment. And then they largely stay there, and there's a bit of fluctuation up and down, but they largely stay in equilibrium. Over the entire course of human history, we've never done that. We've never established an equilibrium. We've just continued to grow, continued to change the environment, continue to modify it to fit ourselves so that we can grow more. And this is kind of why people think that eventually this will continue beyond the planet, and essentially we will do the same thing to the solar system and then to the galaxy and then beyond, right? We will just keep going. If you look at the history of it, it is possible to think that. So maybe adaptation is not for us. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure where I stand on that. Because as much as I like the idea of equilibrium, I know the human thing is to constantly try to change things, right? The minute you establish some kind of order or system, people want something different. So that constant expansion and growth that we've had, I'm not sure we can stop that instinct, but maybe perhaps what we can do is think about the way we continue to develop and what development means, right? To not so much limit our impact on the world, on the environment, on solar system, essentially, but more about thinking if we want to change it, how do we change it? Because we're also going to be changing ourselves as we go along. So it comes back to my original point, which is what is our philosophy for expanding, for growth, for development? If the entire idea is, oh, we just want more resources to make more stuff so that there can be more of us, that will be largely destructive. But if it's something more about seeking knowledge beyond where we are, there will be a lot more control to it. There will be a lot more thought about where the resources for it are coming from, about what it's costing us to build those things. And that can proceed a certain way. So I guess my answer is kind of somewhere in between. It's adapting a bit, but not adapting to the point of equilibrium. Adapting up to a point with room to mutate and continue to change and grow and become essentially an interstellar species.
So it's interesting how you said kind of adaptation is not for humans. And I was just thinking about how I've been exploring this concept too, of how like humans seem to be building a lot of things and almost terraforming the world in a way so we don't have to adapt instead of doing what everything else in the world is doing, which is adapting and kind of try to change things rather than change ourselves. And I feel like that kind of connects with like social psychology of how, you know, when something bad happens, your first train of thought is to blame something or someone else rather than look within yourself and kind of unpack that situation or whatever it is. And it's like we are growing, but we are not growing at the same time. And we're resisting change, but we constantly want to change things. But yeah,
we're a complicated species.
yes, but I did want to go on a tangent because I wanted to talk about your story, performance review, which is kind of like, yes, toxic productivity and kind of like the grind culture that we've developed. And especially with like shortening attention spans and kind of like building pressure of like the labor market, social media, things like that, and the way that workplaces, but also like audiences that were content creators are demanding more and more from their employees, longer hours, less privacy, fewer days off, and kind of efficiency over balance and mental health and family, which you kind of touch upon in some of your stories. Not just in performance review, how people kind of sacrifice their connection to people they love and kind of like not, instead of spending time with those people, they use it on career building and things like that. And I was wondering what your thoughts on technology and kind of its impact on the labor market and things moving forward?
Yeah, so the idea for that story actually first came to me in I guess 2014, because as part of my job, I have like an annual performance review, right? You can see where the story came from. And I had one that was especially concerning, where you go through this process of, okay, so what did you do? How does that align with company objectives? How do we think you could do better next year? Which, in a sense, are good things. But I just thought, this could get very dark if the company essentially continues to change people to try to fit their objectives without reviewing what those objectives are. So, because you're the one that's evaluated, but you don't get to evaluate what the company's objectives are. The employee is always the one that's evaluated in the context of how well did you conform to what we want. And very rarely, very few companies have a mechanism by which the employee can say, well, actually, I think I don't like the way the company is going. These are not the objectives I want to be contributing to. It kind of gets at, I'm actually writing a sequel to that story, which I'm thinking about the future of work and what that could look like. But this is kind of the kickoff point, which is, if we have companies and corporations who are driven blindly towards profit, and as employees within a company, we are all contributing towards it and trying to help make just that profit, it kind of stands to reason eventually these companies, they don't particularly care what the cost is, right? Because they don't account for it. I talked about economics models that don't include anything like employee happiness, employee health, none of that. None of that is reported in the shareholder statement, right? The only thing that's reported in shareholder statement is how much profit did we make? And if there was some kind of major environmental issue that could potentially cost money, then it might be noted. But beyond that, people generally don't care. So it stands to reason that if that's the focus, eventually they would, if they had an opportunity to change people, they would. And in the story, this is kind of what I imagine, is this lady is essentially being coerced by the company to take a drug that would change the way she thinks so that she can be a better employee. And it kind of shares the same thread with Ganger, in the sense that it is a different way of someone trying to plant something in your mind to make you conform to their objective, right? In Ganger, in the novella Ganger, it's more nanomachines that are mirroring your thoughts and reporting them with surveillance, and then with the objective being to try to control them. In performance review, it's a medication that will change the way you think so you can become a better employee. And with the story, I don't get into it too much. I just kind of wanted to show how horrifying such a proposition can be. So it's almost like a short Black Mirror-esque style of story where you just get this really creepy situation that's founded in technology, but we don't really get to explore it too much. And I think that's kind of set up with the way the world is now, right? With the way companies want things, with the way everything is all about more, more, more. We want more efficiency, more productivity. You already mentioned even content creators. You have to post daily. If not, the algorithm forgets about you. You're rewarded for constantly being on, as if nothing else matters. I personally think it's a terrible situation. You wrote a great novelette about this, right? I Am I, or I Am AI. I've never known how do you say the name?
I say I am I, and it's like
okay,
meant to trick people into thinking which one it is.
okay. That was my original thought. I Am I. You wrote a great novelette about this as well, about what that means in that kind of culture, to be steeped in that kind of situation where all you're doing is just chasing some kind of company objective. You need to deliver something. I think it's fundamentally not human, and I think we will change eventually. I think many people have already seen the cracks. Many people smarter than me, more familiar, with more literature background on the topic, have looked at this and proposed alternate models for working. um, alternate ways of being useful, valuable members of society that are contributing something, while also getting this space to be human, to relax with friends, with family, to have time to even just meditate on things. This is something that kind of bothers me a lot with modern social media and just modern hyperconnectivity, is that no one takes time or space to meditate on things anymore, to actually, well, I wouldn't say no one, but generally speaking, many people don't. It goes a bit to shorter attention spans. I don't even want to say that is for sure a fact, right? But I know that with saturation of just media and content and information, there is less time for people to just sit with things and process them and think about them. So I personally resist this. I'm very much a sit with something and think about it. You don't need to issue a response to everything every time immediately. No one needs to know your thoughts every single minute. You don't need to generate content every single minute. For the in a similar way, you also don't need to be working or contributing to some company's goals every single minute. Sometimes being able to sit back and meditate on your own existence, because being alive is kind of a miracle, right? Like I'm always stunned sometimes by the miracle of just us existing at this time in this place. All the random collisions of molecules that have somehow led to this configuration of reality is kind of a miracle. And sometimes sitting back and processing that and thinking about it and thinking about what the future could be, trying to think of what future we want is important. Because if you don't, if you're kind of swept up in hyper productivity and hyper connectivity and everything is just always happening everywhere all at once, all the time, you never have time to process, which means you never really have time to think about what comes next or what you would like to come next, which means essentially someone else is building your future for you. Someone else that is setting the objectives that you're chasing. Someone else that is the people that design the algorithm are the ones thinking about what next, while everyone else is just swept up in whatever they came up with 3-4 years ago. And they're thinking what next. So it kind of I'll kind of conclude this statement with something that I think Ivor Hartman, the editor of the Afro SF anthology, said. If you don't think about your own future, someone else will do it for you. So sometimes getting caught up in company objectives, productivity, generating capital, all of this stuff, if that's not what you want, we kind of need to individually figure out a way to step back and slow down and meditate on things to try to figure out how to change them and how to make a better framework for a better future.
This makes me think about how I would have never kind of pursued writing. Maybe I would have later in my life if I did not have the time during COVID to step back and really think about the direction of my life, because it kind of forced everyone to be very perpetually with themselves. And some people don't like that, but some people really took it in stride, where they sat down and was able to kind of reflect on everything without everything moving, constantly moving fast around them, right? And yeah, and you were talking about kind of like the working hours of toxic productivity and things like that. And I was just thinking about this review I got. I know we're not supposed to read reviews. um about working hours, and it was about someone not like in North America right now, talking about how their own working hours are like 14, 15 hours a day, but in IMI she's only working 10. I'm like, why is 10 like considered not a lot? But she's also like trying to get like 150K words done in 10 hours, right? But then it's just like the mentality that we just have to push past our limitations. And this kind of brings me to the next thing I wanted to discuss, the last thing I promise. Because you kind of touch upon this in Ganger too, in the parallels you draw between kind of like the sci-fi narrative and the folklore narrative, and the way our body kind of ages, the way we are plagued maybe with like illness, disease, aches, hunger, thirst, pain, and what I feel like that is kind of what reminds us that time still moves, a physical reminder when the psychological does not suffice, kind of in uh Dream of Electric Mothers, where when you go into the timescape, you're like detached from your body. Um, but then when you come out, you're kind of like disorientated and trying to reconnect. But when you feel like that out of bodiness, it almost feels like you are not human, if that makes sense. And time is not passing. And it makes me kind of muse on what if, like in the future, we do get uploaded and it's like a nature versus nurture situation. And if human flesh did not exist and the future generations were kind of grown in a place where they are not attached to human flesh at all, would they feel a lack, you know?
Oh, okay. So this is the plot of an entirely new science fiction story. But yeah, it's a great question. It kind of goes back to one of the fundamental problems of philosophy, which is the what we call the hard problem of consciousness, right? Because we actually don't know what consciousness is, or if it can actually be hosted outside of a body, right? In science fiction, we do this all the time. We just say, yeah, you're just going to upload your mind like you upload data from software or something. The truth of the matter is that's actually a bit of an outdated point of view of what consciousness is, of thinking about it as, oh, our consciousness is the software and our body is the hardware. And because we can separate the two things for computers, we should be able to separate the two things for people. Yeah, it doesn't really work like that. It's a model for thinking about the human brain and the human mind, but it's not entirely accurate. And this has been shown in a few different studies that there is an embodiment required with the mind. I kind of mentioned it in Ganga that I cut out about 4,000 words from Ganga because I went off on a bit of a tangent about the theory of embodiment of mind and what does it mean. Because in the story, people are literally transferring their consciousness into an artificial body. And I do show a little bit how you are changed by that process, by moving the so-called soft parts of your brain, the software parts of your mind, into a new body. You're essentially creating a new person, right? This new combination of software and hardware is a different thing than what it was in your original body. But I did have a lot more about that. And some of it got caught during revisions because it's just like, do you really want to stop in the middle of this conversation about political structure and what the villain is doing to have a 4,000 word discussion with yourself about what it means to be embodied versus not? So it got cut out. But essentially, I personally think that, at least based on the science and the information we have today, there is a very strong link between mind and body. And many other traditional cultures have this same view, right? They've always viewed the body and the mind as intertwined, right? Parts of your mind are hosted in parts of your body. Obviously, the brain is a physical thing, which is where all your thoughts kind of float on top of. But it is interesting to think about what humanity would be if we could move our thoughts around, our consciousness to some degree. If we move them out of our current bodies, I still think you would need some kind of embodiment, maybe a different embodiment. Maybe perhaps you could upload minds into ships, into artificial bodies, into something else. It's like Anne McCaffrey's The Ship Who Sang, right? You basically have a human mind in a ship. There's many stories about mind ships. So having some kind of physical structure. And in those stories and in Ganger as well, I get into how moving your mind whatever we think consciousness is into a new body changes who you are and your sense of self. I'm not sure we could have completely disembodied minds. That's something that is interesting to think about. It's something I've written about, not in the context of humans, but in terms of an artificial intelligence that's a purely disembodied mind. But let's say for the sake of argument that we could, for sure, those would be, I would consider them a completely new species, a completely different version of humanity than others. And they will have their own ways of seeing things, their own ways of understanding and processing the environment because they have no physical connection to it. So there'll be a very big difference there. It would be interesting. To me, this sounds like the plot of a story that you should write. So.
Okay, I actually have one quick thing. This is purely for myself. Would you consider offering that 4A that was cut, that 4K that was cut as bonus content? Or could you just send it to me so I can read it?
Actually, I think I can. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I have a draft that yeah, I can send you some of that so you can read it. Yes, why not?
Yes. I love philosophical musings. But
yeah.
Okay, that is the last of my questions, I promise. So I will toss it back to Becca to see if there are any audience questions. If not, we can give some like final thoughts.
Yeah, so now if we have any audience members who would like to jump in, this would be the perfect time. We're at about 6:17 and whatever early hour it is for Wole at this point. So we do have a little bit more time. We've got about 13 minutes. Otherwise, I guess an easy standard book selling question that we ask absolutely everyone is, for both of you, what are you reading?
Ooh. You want to go first, Anne?
Oh, no, it's going to take me too long to think about. Okay.
About what you're currently reading? You're reading so many things?
Yes, because I'm reading I've requested too many things on NetGalley. We won't talk about that. But there are like 20 things on my TBR that I'm reading all at the same time. But so I would say one that I recently read, which is the Dead Cattails Assassins by P. Djeli Clark. Very fun, very short, very fast. Highly recommend.
I'm looking forward to that one. It has a great cover.
Yes. Very cool.
Yeah, Fenderson is the best. I love the way he writes. What am I currently reading? I am about to finish Lotlo Tamas's Womb City, which is fascinating. I'll put it that way. It's a fascinating book. That it does it in fact it covers. I mean, I had a talk with Lotlo last week, and we were both surprised by how many themes we have in common between the novella Ganger in Convergence Problems and in Womb City. A lot of themes about mind transference between different bodies, about surveillance and control, all taking place within a city. Although we come at it from very different ways, because Lotlo's story is sci-fi, but also kind of horror. There is, a ghost shows up, a terrifying ghost shows up in the story. So yes, I'm enjoying that, and I'm looking forward to finishing it, landing the plane, right? There's all these plot points, a lot of stuff has happened, and we're at the point where I think I'm at the final 30 pages or 20. So I just need to land the plane and see where it all goes, and then I'll have my final opinion. But so far, fascinating book.
Fun. Always
and
good
beautifully
to have.
written.
That's what we need. More beautifully written, fascinating, well thought out books. Like there too, I have dropped a number of times the order buttons for Convergence Problems and Link Hunt. I can drop those again for chat for anyone who missed them the first few times. And we've got a nice little comment from Rob Sawyer saying great discussion. And next
Rob. Hi,
time,
Rob.
Rob says as well, next time you actually need to come here for the event.
Yes. I would love to. I actually considered a trip to Canada in June, but I have way too many travel things. I'm traveling tomorrow. No, literally tonight. I'm traveling tonight for work. And then I need to travel again in April. And then I need to travel again probably in August or July. So yeah, there's just so many things happening. I just couldn't fit it in, but I would love to come back to Canada and do a proper book event. Yeah.
Well, we'll be happy to host you. And at this time of year, the weather is probably a bit nicer in Australia.
Well, that depends on what you like, because the weather in Australia is mental. And by that, I mean, you get 3 seasons in one day. Okay. I'm in Perth, Australia, so I should preface that. Melbourne and Sydney are probably nicer. Perth is interesting because sometimes you wake up and it's winter because it's freezing cold. Well, it's not freezing cold, but it's like 15 to 20 degrees. And in a few hours, it can spike up to 43 degrees. So Celsius.
It's a little bit hot.
But yeah. Yeah. So it goes from like, oh, I need a hoodie to, oh my God, I need a fan and air conditioning and I'm dying. So yeah, the weather is all over the place. But that's Perth summer for you.
Yeah, for us, we're having a weird Toronto winter where tomorrow it's a high of 5 and a low of -15.
Yikes. Yikes.
Yeah.
Is all I can say. Yikes.
I'll take the heat instead. But I think with that, no other audience questions have come in. So thank you so much, Thank you so much, Wole, for coming here this evening, this morning, your conceptual time of day to join this amazing discussion. We appreciate everyone who's going to chat, and thank you guys for coming here and doing this event with us. And again, you can order Convergence Problems through our website, and there are some great little holographic stickers that come with it.
Holographic because it's the future.
Exactly.
All right. No, thank you very much for hosting. And yeah.
Thank you for having me.
And the stream